Hello everyone, welcome to Painting Crafty, and today I'm not painting, I'm actually sewing. I'm going to be creating this little cute witchy gal with her little whimsical look. I purchased this pattern from the Etsy shop Chestnut Junction. Kelly is a very talented designer and her shop is loaded full of primitive and whimsical style patterns. Actually, Kelly is the first one who inspired me to even try creating something like this. I'm a relatively new sewer, but even I could create something as cute as this. Today I'm a part of a YouTube collaboration and the theme is called Everything Witchy. It's with the group called Up All Night Can't Sleep. I'll give you some more information about my friends a little later on, but let's start this journey of creating this little whimsical style witch. This pattern is a downloadable digital pattern, so after you pay for it, all you have to do is download it and then print it off on your copy machine. I just printed mine on regular copy paper. You'll have pattern pieces for her body, her arms, her legs, her little nose that pokes out, her hat, and that little cute pumpkin that sits in front of her. I used muslin to go ahead and create the body and the legs out of, and I'm just tracing my patterns right onto the muslin. I'm using a friction pin. A friction pin will disappear with heat, so this works perfect to trace the pattern pieces on. I decided to go ahead and switch it up a little bit and use some black fabric for her hat. I had picked this pillowcase up at my local thrift store for 75 cents, so it was a bargain, and I brought it home with me and it worked great to create her hat with. Because the fabric is black, I used this chalk pencil to trace around my patterns, and that way I was able to see it. For the pumpkin, I used some flannel fabric and I needed to turn it inside out before I traced the pattern on it because it has a wrong and a right side. I like the texture of this and I thought it would work well to create the pumpkin out of. To create her dress, I was going to be using two different patterns of cotton fabric with Halloween themes on them. Kelly's instructions have lots of written instructions, and she does have a YouTube channel with a few videos on there. So between the written instructions and her YouTube videos, I was able to put this dress together. I'm very much a beginner sewer, so this was going to be a challenge for me, but it wasn't as hard as I thought, and between the written instructions and the video, I was able to put it together quite easily. This little dress was one of the main reasons why I purchased this pattern, plus her cute little whimsical face was just so sweet. I had to learn how to do it. So I was glad I tried, stretched myself, learned a few new things, and I'll try it again. Once you have your pieces all traced out, then you're going to take them to the sewing machine and go ahead and sew around them. This is just very basic skills of sewing. All I know how to do is go forward and back, and I really can't even sew a straight line, and curves are still a little challenging for me, but I still enjoy the process of trying. And actually, you know what? It doesn't really matter if they're perfect. As long as you're kind of around the area, that's all you need. Here you can see me. I've already stitched around this body, and now I'm going around the pattern and trimming about a 1/4 inch all the way around. You're going to need to have this little bit of edge left because you're going to go around with your scissors and make little nips all the way around, and that's just going to help your seams lay a lot flatter. Especially at that neckline, I added a little bit of a triangle piece there so it would even lay out a little bit smoother when you're putting your stuffing in. Once you have your things all trimmed around and then had the little nips put inside there, you need to go ahead and turn your pieces to the right side out. I like using those little turning tools. You see that little plastic tube sitting there? They include a little turning stick as well, and that works great for pushing on the seams and laying them flat. My desk looks like a mess and I have everything everywhere, but when I create, I have stuff everywhere. I'm sure I'm not the only one that feels like there's a bomb that goes off when you're creating, when you're crafting. I have stuff everywhere. Here you can see me put that tool inside of there, and then I use that little stick that I was using before and I poke it in there, and then I just push it up, and that turns those little arms and the little feet right to the right side out. It's the best little tool, and it makes the job of turning those small little pieces so much easier. Well worth purchasing those little turning tools. I'm hoping to have some links down in the description box of some of the things that I used, but I'm up all night creating, right? It's that collaboration. Up all night, can't sleep, creating. So if I get those links in there, I'll make sure I include the turning tools and some of the other items that I use. Up next is to add the polyfill. I like using a hemostat tool, which acts like a clamp, so I can take a small piece of polyfill, put it in my clamp, and then I can push it down into those little areas. The arms and the legs are very small, so this tool works perfect for able to get a bit of that polyfill into the small little areas. And then I put a few pieces in there, and after I have a few pieces in, I can take a stick from my turning set. You could use a knitting needle or a chopstick if that's what you might have. And then I can pack my polyfill. It's really important to pack all of your polyfill. Just when you think you might have enough, you probably don't. You want to push it down inside. By doing that process, that really will make more of a dense quality doll, and you'll have a better quality in the end. And that way your neck will sit better, your toes of your boots and the heels will pop out, and you're really going to be surprised if you take the time to do the packing how much better your items will look. For the arms and the legs, you only fill them halfway full. Kind of think of it as being an elbow and a knee. For the hat, I only filled the very point of the hat, and I'm not going to fill the body quite yet. First, I want to attach the legs to my little character. I'll show you after I stitch it what it looks like. I followed the instructions from the pattern of how to make the bottom part of her dress, and I have the fabric turned inside out so I can create the basting stitch or the ruffle stitch all the way around. This is just a simple up and down stitch that I'm going from the back to the front, and this is going to be able to help me gather the fabric to create that little ruffle pleated look around her dress. This gathering stitch isn't a permanent part of the little dress, it's only to help create the ruffles. Once you have it gathered all the way around, then you can go ahead and take it and size it a little bit bigger than the shirt to arrange your ruffles. Go ahead and tie it off in the back now, the knot, because you have it a general size of what you want it. And you might notice that my shirt is turned right side out, but the skirt is still inside out. There's a reason for that. You need it this way so that you can go ahead and sew the two pieces together correctly to have this dress form. Kelly has a video on her YouTube channel that explains this a little bit better than what I'm trying to. This was just my first time, but between her written instructions and her YouTube video, I was able to get it together, and it wasn't as hard as I thought. So now I have it turned correctly. I'm going to stitch along that side. I first sewed the elbows and the knees for my piece before I attached the legs, and once I put those legs on, I just sewed all the way across. I did add a little packet of glass beads on the inside to add a little weight. And then I turned my little dress right side out, and it turned out so cute. The ruffles looked really good. I only had missed just a few places with my sewing machine, but I was able to just go back and kind of just double back and sew it again to close it all the way closed. And after I had done that, I removed that original stitch because it wasn't going to be permanent, and then turned it the right side out, and it turned out really sweet. Even with making a few mistakes, it still turned out good. Now it's time to add the polyfill to the witch's body. On the pattern, there's an indication of where you leave a side opening. Because you sewed the bottom shut to add the legs, you need another area to get the polyfill in. So again, I'm using the hemostat tools and struggling with it, trying to get that little polyfill bunch inside of that hole. But that little tool helps me be able to push that polyfill where I need it, just like the legs. But even though it's a bigger area, this tool comes in handy to get that polyfill inside of there. I can push it to where I want it and then use my packing tool again and go ahead and pack it in. The one area you really need to pay attention to is that neck area. You need to make sure it's filled and packed in there pretty tightly. That'll allow your neck to stand straight up and your character won't have a wibbly wobbly bending neck. Once your body is completely full of the polyfill, you're going to need to hand stitch the hole shut. I just use a needle and thread and a simple little ladder stitch to do this process with. I was also going to be hand stitching the top of the arms on as well. I'm using black thread for my little gal, but you could use a thread that matches your piece completely. I was just choosing to use it as a design element to add the black thread for the joints and the tops of the arms. I also sewed her with black thread. You can see little peaks of it all the way around. I just kind of like that primitive look and that rustic feel, and that's why I chose to do the black. Up next is that little tiny witch hat. I had stuffed the top and now I need to cut a slit all the way through my fabric. I laid the top of my hat down, measured it, and then used a utility knife to cut a slit all the way through. I was going to be placing that piece in there and then separating it and then using a needle and thread and stitching all of the pieces together to create the hat and the brim. I really like this pattern detail of having this small little witch hat on the very top. It just adds that extra layer of whimsical to this character. Up next, we're going to do a little painting. I'm going to give this gal some black boots, so I took some acrylic paint, add some water, and that just helps it glide across the fabric so much nicer. Her boots are about ankle length. When you're doing the acrylic painting process, you just need to be aware that you don't have a lot of drips and drops of paint on your surface, because if you do get the paint anywhere else you don't want it, it's permanent. It's not going to come off so easily. If you do get a little paint somewhere you don't want it, you could always try a little rubbing alcohol on that area and rub it with a Q-tip to see if you can remove it. But the best thing to do is just be very aware of where you might have paint. The boots were going to be black, but she was going to have leggings on, and I chose the color pumpkin spice to make the leggings with. I made little tick marks on the front of her area of where her boots were. I held them close to each other so I could kind of tell where they matched, and then created those little tick marks up her leg, and then just continued around the edges using a small little flat brush. The flat brush worked perfect to make these tiny little lines, and again, they don't have to be perfect. They can just be painted on. They can even have a little wibble wobble in them, and it's not going to really matter as long as you have the same number of stripes. Now that the legs were done, I was going to be working on her face. I started with her blush cheeks. I like using this little scruffy nylon brush. It's rather soft. You use just a dry brush of color. I started with the pumpkin color first to add that little orangey glow underneath, and then I was going to be adding a coral color on the top to add the little layer of pink. Once the cheeks were done, I could add the rest of the face elements, and I started with the eyes. I was just going to be using an end of a paintbrush to dot her eyes in. You just use a slight little pressure with it loaded with black paint, and they make a perfect little round eye. I was going to be trying to use the Micron pen to create her eyebrows and her mouth and her little lips. I had never done this before, so it was the first time doing it, and I don't know if I really liked it or not. My Micron pen wasn't quite dark enough, I didn't feel, with having the darkness of the eye. Plus it was super tricky because my hand just kind of wiggled a little bit at the bottom of the mouth, and you can't get rid of it. It's on there permanent. So I'm not for sure if I liked using the pen or not. I definitely need to practice it more. I went over it first with the pen, and then I ended up going back with a really small fine brush and doing it with paint to cover up my oopsie because the bottom of her smile wasn't right. When using that brush, I just watered down the paint just a little bit and then twist my brush as I'm pulling it through to make sure I have a nice sharp tip with my brush. And then that way I was able to do some lashes. I did have a little bit of wiggly motion at the top of the eyebrows. That's why they got a little thicker in the one area, but I think it looks okay. I did add a little black dot in the center of the mouth, kind of acting like lips. And that kind of helped cover up my oopsie spot. But the thickness of the brush and the paint actually blended it all together and you didn't really notice. For the freckles, I ended up using my stylus, which is kind of a metal tool with those rounded ends on it. And that's what I used to tap in the freckles. I think I did a pretty good job at saving her. You'll have to let me know in the comments if you think it looks okay. Once your paint is dry, you want to use some light grit sandpaper and sand those painted areas. That's just going to help the fibers of where you painted to kind of settle down. If you get a little bit of dust from the paint, you can always wipe it off with a dry paper towel. I wanted to take a minute to thank all the hosts for tonight's collaboration. We have Monica with Up All Night DIY, Dawn with Shabby Meets Bling, Annie with Crafting with Indie Annie Jones, and Jody at Southern Seasons. You can find the links to their channels inside of the description box, as well as a playlist for all of the other videos that have been contributed for today's All Things Witchy playlist. Now it was time to put on that little nose. I basically stitched it shut with a light colored thread on the back first to make the back a little bit more flat, and then I went through the middle of where I wanted to have my nose be, and then I just continued to stitch around my nose, going up and under about 2 times all the way around, and that seemed to secure it tightly. Another new stitching skill I learned was how to create these laces. You start at the bottom and then you kind of create a candy cane pattern stripe all the way up on one side, and then you take your other string on the other side and you duplicate that same candy cane stripe pattern all the way through. Kelly does have a video on her Chestnut Junction YouTube page that just goes over this step-by-step process of how to do the lace work on these boots. I found it super helpful to watch that video. I could see where this stitch pattern would come in super handy with creating Santa boots, witch boots, or even creating other small little details. It wasn't that difficult to do, but I thought it made a really strong impact on creating that image of that these boots do have laces. Now that I have all the lace work done and she's completely painted, it's time to cover her with a coffee stain. I use 1 cup of water to 3 tablespoons of instant coffee, and I mixed that together and then used a chip brush to apply the coffee stain all over her and on her clothes, the pumpkin, and her hat. All the little elements get the coffee stain. Once she is completely covered with the coffee stain, I will bake her in the oven. I usually say anywhere from about 250 to 300. You start her on her back, and you want to make sure that she's on her back because there will be some darker spots on the back area where the heat will absorb and they will brown a little darker. So you don't want that to apply to the front of her face. So always start her on her back, and you leave her there for about 10 minutes, then touch her, and if she's dry all the way on the front of her, you can go ahead and flip it over if you want to. I didn't flip her over though. I just let her be, and I just turned off the oven once she felt dry on the top and let her sit there until the oven was all the way cool. By baking her in the oven and the clothes in the oven, it kind of gives it a little bit of a crunchy feel and adds a little extra stiffness to her. It's just kind of a bonus, and it really does add that aged look to these little whimsical, primitive style characters. And this is what she looks like when she's all dry. Now it's time to go ahead and add the hair. I'm going to be using yarn for this. I just followed the instructions of how long to make them and how many. I was going to be sewing them on to the middle of her head first, so I just divided them in half and took a stitch in the middle, up and around. I took 2 stitches and then tied a knot, and then that secured her hair in the middle. When bringing your hair down to the sides, it looks nice if you go ahead and give it kind of a gentle twist. And then I went ahead and tied 2 little ponytails off to the side. Once I had the ponytails, I took my thread and did basically the same thing. I attached it by creating a knot through and up and around. You just want to make sure that your knot is more towards the back of your face instead of the front, because you might see it in the end. Once you have the little side pigtails all attached, go ahead and take your scissors and give them a little bit of a trim. To help my hair to be even a little bit more attached, I do have some felting needles, and I took my felting needle and just went up and down and made it a little bit more tighter to all the way around the head. I like that way it looked, and it kind of just secured it and held it down a little bit tighter. On the pattern, it does just have the more simple way of just sewing it on, but I found I like to add this little extra step of tapping in the yarn using the felting needle. For a finishing detail for her little pigtails, I added a little bit of black fabric to each of the pigtails. I used the same fabric that I created her hat from. Now let's go ahead and attach the hat. On the pattern, it says to take some wire and poke it into the center of the hat. This is just going to allow me to be able to bend it and shape it easily. Once you have the wire into that part of the hat, you're going to take it and then poke it through the back of your head, right next to the seam, but not on it. Once I had the wire poked in, I used a little bit of hot glue to hold it down for a quick grab, but added a little bit of the Lean's clear gel tacky glue to make sure it was going to hold fast. To add the little jingle bell on the end of her hat, I used some black embroidery floss and just attached it that way. She's almost done. I need to make a slit at the top so I can slide it over her head. I'm going to be adding some dark colored buttons with some orange color embroidery floss that I had already coffee stained and dried it in the oven as well. I'm going to use that same orange embroidery floss to do a gathering stitch around the neckline and the cuffs. So that will be able to cinch it in and fit it a little bit better to the top of her body and around her hands. I'm going to do this the same way I did that a skirt, but this time the thread stays. Her finishing details are just about done, but let's go ahead and take a look at what she looks like sitting in my studio. And here she is, looking cute as can be. I hope I've inspired you to give sewing a chance. Even if you're just beginning and you don't have a lot of skills like me, you really can create something quite cute. If you're new to my channel and you like doing art and crafts, come on over and see what I'm doing. I'd love to have more creative friends join me. Leave me a comment, give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this tutorial. If you like this tutorial, here's a couple more you might want to check out. Well, thanks for joining me this evening, and hopefully you'll come back and join me again, and perhaps next time you'll create right along with me.